Folks, I am elated. You have no idea how elated I am to tell you that I have somebody back with me for round number two, and it's Glenn Steckling. We're going to talk about George Adamski and the early era of seeing UFOs here in the United States. Now, early being the 1950s, okay? Folks, I have to say this, and Glenn and I will talk about this. Our first interview is the most stepped on, subdued, suppressed interview I have ever done. And I have done interviews with people that are talking about things that the United Nations don't want us to talk about. That being said, Glenn, thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm always happy to interact and to discuss this subject in which I have been very blessed to have a extensive history and immersion in, and so I'm more than happy to extend what experiences and what knowledge that I have been exposed to.
Well, folks, I got to tell you, I had so much fun. It was actually one of the most enjoyable conversations that I've had in a long time with Glenn the first time we did this. And thank you all for sending emails with questions because I had no idea you all were going to do that. And Glenn and I have been talking because I don't blindside anybody, and I don't think I could blindside him after all these years anyway. But I did tell him some of your questions in advance so that we could figure out, and I didn't want him to rehearse an answer, but I wanted him to know what was coming. All right, so I'm honest about that. That being said, how have you been? It's been a couple of weeks.
Well, as you know, I had some computer technicalities and have been working through that. And I have been spending way into the wee hours of the night working hard on finishing my book.
Yes.
I've got all the way down to the last two chapters. So once I get those two chapters done and sent off to my proofreader and formatting, then they will go to the publisher for their overview. And so I'm hoping this book will be out, and that should take about a month. So I'm hoping this book will be out in October. And it talks about in depth many of the issues that we will discuss here and many of the other ones. And so, in fact, the chapter I finished 2 days ago has to do with mass sightings, because there's always the question of, where have they been sighted and how come not enough and whatever. So I dealt with that specifically, and I think people will be very surprised to be reminded that this is not new and it has happened quite often. And we can discuss some of that on the show tonight as well.
Well, now, do you have a working title for your book?
Yes, I do indeed. It is called "Can the UFO Reality? Can Truth Prevail?"
Nice.
And the caption underneath of that is "Over Half-Century Journey in Historical Activism Within the UFO/ET Field."
Sweet. So, can the truth prevail?
Yeah, it's called the UFO Reality - Can the Truth Prevail?
Nice, nice. Now while we're talking about books, folks, there are several books that are available that are from George and from Glenn's father. And now I kind of got lost in that when we were talking about him before. Now, do you already have one book out?
This is the material that we have. George published the first book in 1953 called Flying Saucers Have Landed. That was co-authored with Sir Desmond Leslie in England. And that we had combined with George's second book, Inside the Spaceships. So our copy of Inside the Spaceship that we make available to the public is actually a two-book combination under one title. Then the last publicly published book was called Flying Saucers Farewell in 1961, and that was republished in the paperback behind the Flying Saucer Mystery title in the 70s, and we have elected to keep that title. And in the 2015, I went and I took that book, Flying Saucers Farewell, and then wrote a 70-page prologue to it and included for the first time about 20 pages of pictures and illustrations, photos of the correspondence that he had with officials, all the information that the critics of George tried to lambast him and poo-hoo him so much. I put in that book so people could see for themselves exactly that he had this kind of contacts, and he never fabricated or made imaginary claims and statements. And so we released that as Behind the Flying Saucer Mystery 2 in 2015. My father wrote his first book in 1969, published, called Why Are They Here? Spaceships from Other Worlds. And that was released through Vantis Press in New York City. And I still have a couple boxes of those available in paperback. And then he wrote the book that was released in 1981 called We Discovered Alien Bases on the Moon. And I helped him with the research with that during the late 70s, and to put together the pictures and all the materials that we had gotten from NASA, because due to his contact at NASA, he was directed to which departments to write in order to get first generation copies of the original Lunar Orbiter and Apollo films. And we had these beautiful, and I still have them in the safe, these beautiful 11 by 15 Hasselblad Apollo photographs that you can see of the moon and the Earth and the LEM and the lunar orbiter and all this other material that is clearly impossible to fake. I mean, this stuff is as authentic as it can get. And then what happened when my dad passed away in 91, I took that book and wrote some addition chapters to that and re-released it as We Discovered Alien Bases on the Moon 2 in 1997, which I still have in print. And I still go out and talk publicly and show those pictures quite often. So yes, we have a plethora of material that we have made available, if you include George, all the way back to 1953, and actually further than that if you look at his private writings into the 30s.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, folks, I have to tell you, if you are interested in any of these books, you can go directly to the Foundation site, and they have materials available on that site. Cut out the middleman and buy them straight from the Foundation if you're interested, because first of all, the middleman doesn't need any more money, and the second thing is you're going to get a better quality if you buy direct. Just saying.
Well, having said that, yes, you can get them from me, but you also can get them depending on where you are, sometimes in foreign countries and things like that. It's easier to get them through a distributor. So we have them available on Amazon. We have them available on abe.com, which is a international company like Amazon. I believe it is out of Canada. And then I also put them on eBay as well. So there's 4 different avenues for you to receive materials should you be so inclined.
Nice. Now, the Foundation. Somebody asked me, and I figured that's probably a good place to start since we're already there. When was the Foundation established? That was.
Oh, what happened is in 1965, George passed away. While he was in Washington, D.C., we were there. Madeline Rodofer, who was another contactee and co-worker of George, was there as well. And it was Madeline and my mother who took George to the hospital. And he passed away and then was buried in Arlington Cemetery, not because of any innuendo that some people have made that the government was trying to sponsor him or something behind the scenes. That's not true. As you well know, that only service personnel are allowed to be buried in Arlington. And since George had served in the 13th Cavalry in 1917, that made him eligible. And his direct heir, Alice Wells, who was one of his students since the 1930s, who was the owner of the properties in which they functioned on through the 30s, 40s, and 50s, was the one who made that request to the government, and that was done. And I have the document from President Johnson signing that as well. And so after that, the Foundation started to come together. It was formulated in the late 60s. My father was selected by George to continue on to the work that he had done and to work with the other co-workers that were established in many of the foreign countries. And so in the early 70s, we got together again with Alice here in Vista, California. And then a lot of this material and properties and rights and copyrights were transferred into my father's name. and then we continued the foundation from there. So I can say the foundation's been around probably since 1965 to 68 is when it was developed, so around there. So for a long time, we're one of the longest still functioning, coherent UFO organizations in the country, or if not world.
Nice, nice. And folks, that's the George Adamski Foundation, just in case you missed that part. So now here's another backtrack on George. Let's start with George. Now, George's early years, he was in the military. He was in the cavalry. When did he start experiencing the UFO things? Because I hear a lot of stuff from the 30s and 40s even.
Yes, that is true. I think that, being stationed in the southwestern United States during the, 1917-18 time, during the Mexican-American conflict there, I'm sure that just like as the earlier settlers, experienced in the wide open country range of the western United States, there were a lot of sightings there as well. So I can't say that he didn't have some sightings while being out on the trail and what have you. But I can say that he had always the interest, and in that in the 20s that interest blossomed into, beginning in the 30s, a school in what was then called Laguna Beach. It still is Laguna Beach, California, and that moved from many different areas, Laguna to Dana Point to eventually Valley Center near Palomar Mountain, and then one of the astronomers for Caltech, responsible for the mapping for the 200-inch Hale telescope that was going to get built on the top of Mount Palomar, suggested to them that they move closer to the telescope observatory, so they moved to the base of Mount Palomar in 1945. And that's where a lot of the pictures were taken. But George got his first telescope in 1938, and he took some shots in the Los Angeles basin area. As you can remember, in the newspapers, there was this big hoopla about the so-called invasion of LA, where they had the squadron of UFOs flying over Los Angeles with all the search beams pointed at it, because at that point we were worried about the possibility of a Japanese attack on the U.S. mainland. But he had taken some photographs and submitted it to the government already then in the late 30s, but there was not any response. And George always said, well, and we were so saturated and so concentrated on World War II that that was the emphasis of the entire national project, and so therefore, not until after World War II, when they were able to get some more better quality pictures and submit them to both the government and the military, that then this thing took a greater momentum.
So we know that he was taking photographs. Now, when did George start taking films?
Well, film. George got himself. He was given an 8mm and then later a 16mm movie camera. But the 8mm movie camera, some of the earliest films that I noticed were there was one small section that I recovered from archives that I would say would be probably about 1954. One of the best films he took was in Mexico in 1957, on the border of 57, 58, right there. And then he took a film, what was called the Wisconsin, the Appleton film, in the late 50s. The Boston footage was taken in the early 60s. And of course, and then there's a myriad of smaller films that were taken in between. And then the best known one was the Silver Springs film that was taken in February of 65, just 6 weeks before he passed away.
I didn't realize it was that close to his death. But now, the Wisconsin film, I have seen that in other places. I've seen excerpts from that in other places. Now, was that something that you guys released, or is that something that they somehow got access to?
Well, it could be one of the two. I've released that film a number of times. What I have done is when I took those original films out of archives, first of all, we had those films transferred by Cloverland Films, which was a division of 20th Century Fox many years ago, when there were only two film transfer laboratories in the U.S. One was up there in Burbank and Hollywood. They invited me up. I did an interview. I brought the original films, and we did in person. I watched them transfer them in the laboratory to high definition DVD. So what I did is I took those films and then I watermarked them and made sure that Adamski Foundation was in the bottom corner, because in this particular field, people steal like crazy because they have no legitimate experiences of their own. So they either make it up or they simply hoax it. And so that particular Wisconsin film may have come out before, but I've released it many years ago since. So it could be either one of them, but it's a magnificent piece of film that shows that elliptical spacecraft in the distance moving back and forth at high rates of acceleration and speeds, coming to a dead stop, going the other direction, then moving forward and back. So it shows its maneuverability three-dimensionally. So it's no way that it is faked in any way, shape, or form. It's impossible. And it's a great piece of film.
Well, I wanted to ask because some people had asked me about some of his footage turning up in, like, I think one of them said that it was on the Discovery Channel segment. But I wanted to ask because a lot of people didn't realize that you can actually release those films for use.
Yes, I have. I have, in fact, for many years now, I've got a nice thick file of release forms that I've had that I issued when people are seeking permission to use materials and copyright materials as well. And so I have released it to many places overseas, to the Japanese, to Europe. All over the world, and Discovery Channel. Of late, I've released material to Ancient Aliens and the Unexplained, and I've done the same when through Gaia TV. I did the interview with George Norrie called Beyond Belief, and also with Regina. And we did some very good interviews and releases of film that was put into those interview composites as well. So there's a good plethora of information. I've also got some of it on YouTube as well for the interviews that I have done there, and we've incorporated pieces of the films as well.
Folks, I wanted to get that cleared up for you all because it's not. In order to use the film that's copyrighted, it has to have a release form with it. So, like, if I was doing a video format and I wanted to use one of those, I would have to have a release form. Okay. So anybody who's got this footage, they have contacted Glenn or the foundation directly, and that's how they've gotten access to it.
That's correct. And to make it clear for people, we are probably one of the few, if only, organizations that do not charge royalties. The only thing the release form is that it stipulates that people have to honestly use what they're requesting, and that they have to reference the source, and that there are no royalties involved, but they cannot also bank vault it or archive it and sell it to anybody else as a medium party. The people have to come directly to me. So there are not any unusual stipulations or clauses in order to control things. It's just the very standard stuff. And the reason we've done that is because I have seen over the many decades people use George's material but never give him credit for that. And to give you an example, there was a disclosure hearing in the late 2000s, I think 2009, in which the gentleman from one of the institutes, I think Paradigm, was sitting there and showing pictures of UFOs to the panel, and they would say, okay, this picture is from so-and-so, and this picture was taken by so-and-so. And as I'm watching that, they pull out a couple of George's pictures, and they never mention his name, never give him credit for having taken the pictures. They just simply said, well, here's another photo, and then they put it in the stack. And so I have found that over the years, there has been a very concerted, concentrated effort to try to ignore or negate and to prevent people from having any factual information about George Adamski. They just want you to see all the negative stuff that people have implied, not proven, implied. Yes. And so they want you, like Wikipedia has a whole page on George that says nothing but negative stuff. And so they have an avenue in which you can type on a link and then put in information that says that if you feel contrary, provide the information and the foundation or the proof of it. And I've done it several times and they completely ignore it. So I thought, okay, maybe they recognize my name. And so so consequently, I had some friends from around the country do the same thing, and they did exactly the same thing, wiped it clean. So if you don't think that that is purposeful, then you might want to think again.
Now, we talked about the photos and the films, and folks, if you have not seen them, they are amazing. There are a lot of interviews that Glenn has done where he's presented this stuff. I put some links up for you, but he has a page on YouTube as well. So you can find Glenn on YouTube. You can find interviews that he's done over time that are just phenomenal, and they show the photographs and the films. I've spent a lot of time since I talked to him last time doing a lot of deeper research. I wish I'd have done it 2 decades ago instead of just now. Now, with the military and the intelligence, we know that George had been contacted and had been in contact with the Pentagon and generals and various groups within the military while he was alive. Some people were asking, were these intelligence groups or were these like operational groups?
Well, first of all, let's make a brief statement here. People have thought that saucer-shaped crafts, or what we refer to as bell-shaped craft in the scientific community, is a manifestation of certain war projects. So let's do a very quick history oversight. In Europe alone, photographs of these type of crafts were taken as far back as 1918. As you well know, that was long before the National Socialists came into power in 1933, and the so-called projects in Peenemünde did not happen until 1939. The Germans noted these particular crafts in their sky. And if you look also in past history, whether you go into the medieval times and the murals or the biblical times, there are renditions of these type of crafts going back for thousands of years. Yeah. So anybody who says that a bell-shaped or saucer-shaped craft is just a fake or configuration has really done zero research or has any historical knowledge. Okay. So
this is something that you and I wanted to address anyway, because a lot of people, to bring this to the forefront, y'all, a lot of people who were asking me about this pointed out that the Germans were trying to engineer a similar type of vehicle, but this was after the fact.
That is true. That's true. And people who do a little bit of background will find out that the Germans or the Nazis tried to experiment with craft that were called a Rundeflügel or Feuerball or Hanabu or all kinds of other names, Kugelblitz. So these are all German names for fireball and round object and different types of makes and models. If you do also your research, you'll find out that they never successfully duplicated the craft. They had no clue as to the electrostatic power source or the free energy source. So on the bottom of the shell, they had counter-rotating helicopter blades, like a giant helicopter wheels, and that since the craft is round, created a unstable flight characteristic, and they only traveled a few hundred yards and crashed. And if we look at this honestly, these crafts, these bell-shaped crafts, UFOs, have been reported already doing 20,000 miles per hour, tracked through the atmosphere by radar facilities, and then flying up to large cigar-shaped mother crafts that were 150 miles in orbit that were a mile or 2 miles long. The notion that the Germans could have built this is ludicrous. Yes. If they had those kind of knowledge and resources, they would have won the World War sitting hands down. And yes. So this is nothing more than the promotion of a redirect or a misinformation to try to, once again, negate or debunk the UFO reality. And I address this specifically in chapter 1 of my book. And I'd like to add to that, a lot of people know the name Timothy Good. He has written many books on this subject. I know him personally since the 60s. He wrote Above Top Secret and all kinds of other books, a very well-researched English gentleman. And he said, periodically the myth is revived that Nazi Germany was responsible for the unidentified phenomena of craft reported during World War II. He says there's absolutely no reliable evidence whatsoever that they produced such craft of such extraordinary performance characteristics. And also the fact that they were seen all over the world in every country that you can talk about. In chapter 3 of the second part of my book, it's called Mass Sightings. Absolutely. And I list the places where, as we well know, the mass sightings over Washington in 52, over London in 54, over Paris in 54, also over the Vatican for a whole week, flying information for 7 days, photographed by thousands of people.
Awesome.
And so there's no way that this is this terrestrial or Earth technology. This is thousands of years ahead of our capability. And so, therefore, going back to the military connection, George believed adamantly that this information should not be secret. It should not be held and suppressed, because it involves the well-being and the education of every being on this planet. And so he made sure that the materials that he had, and he was fortunate enough the pictures to take, were shared by everybody, by the government. He gave it to them free. People would drive up to the Mount Palomar property, which was called Palomar Gardens, and is now called Oak Knoll Campground, in which I am holding a UFO symposium this year on November 4th there. And he gave them to the Naval Observatory Laboratory in San Diego. Military officers would come to the property. He would, here, take them and examine them, because he wanted the people who held the authority of the power structure in this country to have viable information, because you can only react to something intelligently and thoughtfully if you have actual tangible information and not just innuendos and accusations and threats and fear. Because if you react on fear, you can do some very terrible things. And at that point, we were sitting on the edge of nuclear holocaust.
Yes. So now he had contacts within the military that he maintained all the way up until his death, right?
When we met him in 1963, he was coming to Washington to lecture to the Air Force Reserves. And my father and mother and I, we were all there. And my parents always said, the first thing that you noticed was in the very front row of the lecture hall sat the military officers in their full uniform. So they were getting information. And, while everybody else may these days read the internet and say, oh, Adamski was a kook or this or that, he certainly wasn't treated that way by the officials in our country and on foreign countries, because he went and saw Queen Juliana in the Netherlands and Pope John the 23rd. And his sponsors in England were Lord Mountbatten, who was the former viceroy of India, the uncle of Prince Philip, and also Desmond Leslie, and Lord Dowding, who was the Lord Air Marshal of all the United Kingdom military air forces. These people were not fools, and they openly stated that they supported what he had to say.
Well, and folks, just to point out to you that because I do a radio style format doesn't mean that I have not seen the documentation. Glenn has done video interviews where he has shown the documentation in the interviews. So it's not like the documentation's not there for people to see. They choose not to see it so that they can do whatever they choose to do with George's information and his legacy. So that's not the way to approach this.
Well, I think that everybody, regardless in what field you are, but let's just take this field, for instance, everybody who speaks out in this field should be held accountable for what they say. Can they prove what they're talking about? Do they have evidence of it? Do they have personal experience in this subject, so they have the foundation on which to talk? Because otherwise it just becomes second and third hand, or even worse, fourth and fifth hand innuendo and domino effect. And so
Yeah.
it doesn't have any real teeth or any real bite. I only talk about what I know, what I've experienced, and what I have documentation and factual. That puts together those three, the foundation upon which I address the public. If I don't know, I say so,
Hmm.
because I'm not in this field for notoriety. I'm not in this field to sell books. Well, the books are practically zero profit because they have to be published and republished all the time, and it gets more and more expensive, and the prices don't change. And so uh, I am here to educate the public, to say, hey, wait a minute here. With all the garbage you hear out here, are you not comparing it to the other side of the equation? One can only make a viable determination of something if you have the both sides of the equation. And there's always two sides to it. But the other side doesn't want you to see that or have that, because then you start to think for yourself. And that is the greatest danger
Yes.
that the opposing groups, whether it happens to be the UFO field or the political field or economic field, any of them, they don't want you to think for yourselves, and you must insist upon it. So this is the reason I'm out there, and it doesn't gather a lot of sympathetic ears or compliments. I must say that I do get quite a few compliments, but oftentimes I don't, which doesn't bother me at all, because I have this thinking that if too many people like you, then you must be doing something wrong. So
Yeah, it's kind of the way I am. I called my interviews "No Apologies" interviews, and I call my podcast "No Apologies, Enough Said." So I don't count on a lot of people. Now we know that George had contact with the military throughout his later life, right up until the time he passed away. As a matter of fact, now did the same go with your father and you in the early years?
quickly, George not only had military contact, but scientific community contact, as I mentioned, Professor Johnson with Caltech, and the scientists that were involved with the establishment of the 200-inch telescope up at Mount Palomar. And he also met with President Eisenhower and brought out in the desert here in California and brought him to the air base where one of these crafts, Adamski, had arranged for a landing and a briefing of the president with human beings from other worlds, not monsters, not anybody looking to trade DNA evidence or blood samples in order to give us technology. This is all rumorous garbage that has been projected since in order to redirect and to put fear into this subject. George also did the same with President Kennedy in 1962. And he met Kennedy already in 1960 on the campaign trail here in California. He issued an invitation to both Kennedy and Nixon. Nixon declined. John Kennedy showed up. They developed a friendship, and George carried a White House access card in which he went into the White House on numerous occasions privately to brief the president. And so, yes, these contacts were extensive. George introduced us to a number of his extraterrestrial contacts that would come to the House. And there would be discussions both at that establishment and sometimes out in the field at lectures and things like that. After George passed away, we continued with those contacts for a number of years. These people do not stay more than a couple of years on our world before they go back home and new ones come. So over a period of time, we've had contacts with these extraterrestrial friends, and they have passed us along a lot of information and a lot of very pertinent insights into things and what have you. And so, but I will say this, no one can summon the space visitors. Anybody who tells you that they can summon them or tell them to come along and be there or tell them what to do, they're charlatans to begin with. The space people decide for themselves who they will or will not interact with after a very, very long, intricate, deep vetting process, because it is a very um, the situation is such that you have to be aware of the kind of person you're dealing with. You have to be trustworthy and honest. They have to be dependable. They have to prove this over a period of time, because there's a lot at stake here. This is not playing games or just doing it off the cuff or in your science fiction imagination or fantasy world. That doesn't exist. This isn't Star Wars, Star Trek, and Avatar. That's just fantasy. But so, and over time, then some newer ones came, but I would say that right now we're kind of in a slow phase, because things go in cycles. There was a immense push during the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and then the United States decided they were going to suppress and ignore any of this information and try to bully the rest of the countries into not talking about it as well. And only after many, many, many years was some of the information released, whether it was in France or the UK. But believe you me, nothing in this field is released before it is thoroughly previewed and thoroughly vetted. They don't release stuff that's going to expose them officially and their agenda. No, no, no. And people who have worked for the government, and there are several personalities out there, whether it's in this country or the UK, and say, okay, we were involved 20 years in debunking this field, but now we're coming clean. Don't you believe it? When you sign those secrecy papers, that's for life.
Yes.
They're not rescindable, and you cannot ignore them on will. So whether you hear that from past individuals or more familiar with the current situation that's going on in Washington, remember, they're telling you only what they've been cleared to tell you.
Yeah, there's a reason why McCullough was sitting behind Bruce when he was giving his deposition.
And as is well said, that nothing can come from military personnel unless the Pentagon vets it beforehand. Exactly. So that tells you right there that there is an overlying force behind what is going to be told to you anyway. So come on.
And a not so pleasant agenda.
And a not so pleasant agenda. That's correct. And so, yes, my father and I have, over time, we've talked to many scientists and people in this field. I've got a letter here that I just incorporated in a new book that we got in 1984 from a astronaut recruit that was going to the moon for several years. This was in the 1960s. And then you say to yourself, well, Apollo 11 was supposedly the first time that we set foot on the moon. But if you do some research, Colonel Corso talks about Project Rainbow, developed in 57 through 67, in which the military was building a lunar bases on the moon. So we were there unofficially long before we went there for the public relations issuance of NASA. Got to remember that NASA, while it is a government bureaucracy, is largely controlled by the military as well. And as you know, all the initial cadre of astronauts were all commissioned to military rank. So they were all subjected to the same restrictions and same parameters as they would be as if they were actively functioning in the service.
Now, we had one person who asked me if George or your father or you, which you would have been too young probably, but had George or your father, either one, had any contact with von Braun and NASA?
Yes, George had some contact with von Braun. Von Braun knew a heck of a lot more than he ever stated. Yes. But von Braun privately stated that he had extended family of children and grandchildren, and it was not worth him to jeopardize them for what he knew. And so, yes, George had some contact with them. My father, no, not with von Braun. We had some contact with some other individuals, Gordon Cooper, my father had some contact with, and things like that. And so, this, there was a whole cadre of people that were involved that came over from the German side to Huntsville, Alabama, and also to White Sands and things like that. And so, all kinds of possibilities arose that the Germans had used a modified V-2 to shoot it at the moon, to crash land parts of it on the moon already before the end of the war. Also that the Russians had a much more sophisticated space program that we admitted to, and had been going or was going to the moon either before or for many years after us. And so I think the book Alternative 3, I believe it was Leslie Watkins who, and the documentary that came from that, talked about the clandestine moon base constructions done by our military agencies, and the consequences of them as well. So these are all part of the total equation of what's going on. As you well know, we are not told the truth about anything. I mean, zero. And so when you dig a little bit deeper, your eyes begin to widen open, and then you start to see many different aspects of what's going on. And one has to be careful not to become too consumed with it, because otherwise you don't want to see shadows behind you, all the time. You still have to live a regular life and have information should be there to awaken your understanding and not cause any senses of fear or paranoia. I am adamantly against the use of fear, and that's another chapter in my book, that fear has been used to control the masses in every avenue and aspect of life, from birth till death. You're afraid of going to school. You're afraid of having to get the job. You're afraid of your earnings. You're afraid that the stock market will crash on your retirement, that the government will take away your Social Security. They literally keep you in a state of fear for the entire portion of your lives. And then they rely on you to react to that state of fear, because you're so controllable then. All you have to do, all that has to be done is the insinuation that something will be taken away from you, and then you right away fall back into that state of fear, and it's reactionism as well. And I think that we need to stop this.
Yes, definitely. Fear is, nothing to fear but fear yourself. And then if you want to go to Dune, fear is the mind killer.
Right.
People do not understand that manipulation, that fear-based, anxiety-based manipulation makes you reactionary rather than thinking logically and rationally and finding a solution. And the problem is they really don't want us to find solutions. They want to keep offering us their solution, which it makes it no better.
Well, in the absence of that vacuum, we're really willing to accept what is given in replacement, because we don't think of anything that we can do ourselves, or we find ourselves, we think of ourselves as so restricted in what our capabilities are. We really have been suppressed to think that the human individual is really not of any consequence or any impact. But yet, if you look at history, you will see it has always been the individual who stood out and didn't agree with the masses or didn't agree with the status quo, that the momentum gathered behind them, until which point somebody became afraid and took them out of the equation, like Gandhi, like King, like Bobby Kennedy. We take those leaders out of the equation because we know that if you cut off the head of the snake, then the snake just withers away.
Yep. Fortunately. Now, in the interest of letting everybody know, because I had a lot of people who asked about your grandfather and your father, and you and I talked about this briefly. Now, your grandfather was a pilot during World War II, right?
Yes, my grandfather was a captain, a pilot who flew, what do you call them, cargo carriers during World War II in the German Luftwaffe. And he was responsible, and he flew cargo carriers from Poland to France. And my grandmother, at one point before she passed away, showed me stacks and stacks of letters that he had received posthumously, as appreciation, because my grandfather would smuggle the best he could Polish Jews out of Poland and fly them to Liberty to France. And
Nice.
and so it goes to show you that even though you're drafted as a soldier or an officer in a system that you don't agree with, you don't get a choice, because if you decline, they just shoot you.
Yes.
So, people do the best they can. And I remember that my father received a letter before he passed away from Israel that thanked him and acknowledged him for his father's actions during World War II. So he died in 43, shot down over France. My father he loved aviation, he loved airplanes. And after the war, as a kid, he went to the North Sea to a glider school in the late 40s, and then enrolled in the German NATO forces to become a pilot. But since the restrictions after World War II on any of the German military were so severe, because naturally they didn't want a replay of World War II or the escalation of military power, so they did not train him as a pilot, and he opted out because he was given that opportunity. And then later in life, he got his private pilot license when he came to the U.S., and he was a recreational pilot. And he and I used to fly all the time together as I was a kid, but he did not do it professionally. He did it recreationally. But he encouraged me to grab the mantle and eventually became flying, in which I did. I started manually flying myself at the age of 16 and 17.
Nice.
Got my first license at 17, and I flew for 45 years, 35 of them professionally for commuters, corporations, cargo, and then eventually airlines. So other than military flying, I can say that I have a long and varied experienced expertise in the aviation field, because I've flown literally dozens of airplanes, makes and models all over the planet.
So now for 45 years as a pilot, and I touched on this before, being in the air, especially at nighttime or at sunset, you had to have had a lot of amazing sightings yourself.
Well, since I had already exposure to this since I was a kid, and had seen these crafts, both far away and up close, and experienced contacts with their extraterrestrial occupants, their human pilots. Of course, I knew more what to look for than some people would, or be more conscientious to actually look for it. So over the years, depending on different places on the world, I have seen the number of these craft maneuvering, once over the Brazilian jungle, another one over the Greenland, North Atlantic, over the Hawaiian Islands, a number of places. And so I would point them out to the rest of my crew, not as to, look, there's a UFO. I would point out the windshield and say, hey, that looks interesting. What do you think? And so they would look out there and then either comment or not comment. I would not push the issue. But to make it more in a roundabout circle, one of my former co-pilots, who's now a captain for a major carrier, he called me up, summer of last year, and he told me, my God, we saw these craft in formation at night flying the red eye from the Hawaiian Islands back to the mainland. And we saw them over a number of days. And then came reports in that from Japan to the Hawaiian Islands over that Atlantic Pacific stretch, that the other crews had seen them. And then there were 5 crews that saw them over the continental United States, each from different airlines, all of them which reported them to air traffic control. And so I would say that his interest was there within him, but after we talked and described it, he became much more vigilant, and then had them themselves. And you cannot shake his confidence in what he saw and the reality of it in any way, shape, or form. You can't. When you finally experience it for yourself, then there's no more doubting involved.
Excuse me, y'all. It's just amazing to me that we have now. Let's be fair. Let's be fair to the pilots that are up there. We know what goes on, and you and I had discussed this before. One pilot reported it, and he ended up having to have psychoanalysis for a year, and was had his wings clipped and all kinds of other punishment for reporting it. Is the system still that bad as far as reporting things like that when you see them?
Well, I would say that that repercussion was earlier in the airline history. The incident you reported happened in 1970. 727 captain reported the UFO to NORAD directly. So of course NORAD then contacts the company, and then they go through their repercussion system, in which he was clipped for a year without pay, and then had to go through all kinds of psychological evaluations and whatever. This type of a retaliation quickly gets around because we're a small community of airline pilots, and word travels fast because you can be in 5 hours in one place and 5 hours in a completely different area across the United States. So the rumor mill is quite extensive. And so many pilots have talked. If you look at Major Kehoe's, Donald Kehoe's books, and he worked for NICAP, or was part of the construction of NICAP, they had over 11,000 sightings logged when they presented it to Congress in the 1960s. That's why I tell people, I said, you really think that you're going to get any disclosure from the current press releases and settings? That's not going to happen. We already went through that in the 60s in a much more thorough and strenuous investigation, and it was all shut down by the CIA and the military. And in fact, Donald Rumsfeld, who I believe was a congressman, said, you don't have the right to know. And that was his public statement. But anyway, so the reporting of these type of things is kind of currently up to the person. So what happens is you will hear blurps like, a couple of years ago, there was a series of airliners coming from east to west overnight over the southwest corner areas, Albuquerque and southwest. Pilots saw something and said to air traffic control, hey, are you painting any kind of air traffic control or radar contact at this and this location? And they said no. And then somebody else pipes in, let's say from America, and says, yeah, we see it too. But none of them, there are few to any that of these crews that are going to sit down afterwards and research to find out where the government paperwork is in order to fill out a full report, because they don't want to jeopardize themselves.
Exactly.
And this is the same for air traffic controllers. I knew a man who knew personally a number of controllers in Phoenix in the ATC system, and they were very strenuous in the past. The same things that they would pull on the pilots, they would pull on the air traffic controllers, as far as the pay and the loss of position and then psycho evals and all this other stuff, in order to dissuade them. And so I think to a general extent, most of the people are just going with it and saying, okay, well, we saw it, end of story. And by the way, they're also busy doing other things. The pilots are busy flying the airplanes and managing the computers, and the air traffic controller's got his hands full with a whole cadre of airplanes from all different directions and altitudes, so they don't smash into each other. So they're busy.
Well, and the other thing I want to point out too is that a lot of times, because I've got a friend who's a pilot, and a lot of times the communication with the towers is just to make sure that they don't actually have a bogey in their way or in an intercept. It's about safety. It's not about reporting the UFO.
That's correct. It is about safety, and if there's something out there that you don't know, like for instance, if I was flying and I saw an object in the distance and it appeared to be closing with me, I first of all will look down on my ADI and see, because there's an overlap on there, what we call TCAS, traffic collision avoidance system, which every airplane has its own transponder code, and that code will reflect a radar image that we can see on the airplane ourselves. It used to be only on the air traffic control, but for a number of years and decades now, we get to see that traffic on our own scope. So if we see something coming that's painting on the radar that has no altitude readouts or anything, we wonder, is this going to conflict with our flight path? And as it gets closer, then I'm going to be prompted to key the mic and call air traffic control and say, hey, do you have an object at 12 o'clock and 20 miles closing? And then that raises their attention level to take a look at it as well. So we don't wait till things get too close to do evasive maneuvers. We do those maneuvers as early as possible.
Yes. Yes. And folks, it's not so much about the UFO as it is safety in the air. Um, you know, it may be something that nobody knows is there. It may actually be a UFO, but it's about avoidance, collision avoidance.
And there's been a number of times when UFOs have flown parallel or in formation alongside our airliners. The very well account of this was out of Alaska, Anchorage, a 747 for Japan Airlines, which reported an 800-foot oval object that was traveling alongside their flight path and their aircraft, and then would speed up in front of it and then fly around them in circles and in loops and things like that. And the U.S. government tried desperately to suppress that story and try to intimidate the crews, but they were a foreign crew, so they basically told the U.S. to kiss off. Yeah. And the Japanese government didn't bother to say anything different.
I remember the Australian crew that actually had footage out their window too. That was pretty amazing.
That's right. So it's happened in a number of areas recently, some in South America and other places. And so once again, anybody who thinks that this phenomena is unreal is really fooling themselves.
Think about the giant oval that decided to hang out at O'Hare for about 2 hours one afternoon.
That's right. And that was reported not only by the air traffic controllers, but all the arriving and departing aircraft as well. Yes. And you would think that hundreds of reports of this would reverberate through the system, and it did. You know, they mentioned it in the news and they mentioned it in the newspaper, but no explanation was ever drawn. And no. And basically, it's using the same old format because they know that people's attention span is about 20 minutes, and that's scientifically proven, if that. And so they know if they just don't say anything for a while, by the time 3 or 4 days go by, everybody forgets about it and goes on with their business. And so,
I had a friend at the time who was flying FedEx, and he said, you know, everybody that was coming in and out of that area at the time was calling air traffic to make sure it was clear because this thing was huge.
Well, I remember an event that happened in Buenos Aires where they reported that one of these bell-shaped saucers flew around the airport and landed at the end of the runway and sat there. And there was an airliner coming in, I believe it was a DC-8 in those years, and they are coming in to land, and they say to the tower, hey, there's something sitting at the end of the runway. Are we cleared to land? And the air traffic control, the tower guy says, yeah, it's been sitting there for a little bit. I guess you probably shouldn't land and go around. So they go around and circle the airport one more time. And in the meantime, the craft takes off and flies and disappears into space. And this is not just in Argentina. It's happened in Canada and happened in other countries. So when people say that they are not making, you know, this Israeli official who came out and everybody starts screaming, oh boy, an official, a title, we can believe him. And he makes a statement that the extraterrestrials are hiding from us as to not cause panic. I have addressed that once again in my book and say, listen, there are tens of thousands of reports, and the reports of these type of calibers, if they're trying to hide from us, they're doing a hell of a bad job about it.
I'd say, well, and we also had the Canadian, the former Canadian minister. That came out and was talking too.
That's right. There was an incident in Canada where there was an air show going on. This happened in the late 50s, I believe, and an airliner underneath a cigar-shaped, what we call mothercraft, an airliner was being carried over the field and then sat down onto the pavement, the tarmac.
Yes.
And then flew off. And then they found out that the craft had run out of gas and had been assisted in reaching a safe landing spot to help all the people on board. So the next time somebody tells you that extraterrestrials come here to hurt you, harm you, skin you, copulate with you, and all this other nonsense, remember that was never so before. This is only to promote a fear agenda. It has no reality and truth whatsoever. And I know this will raise the shackles hairs on the back of a lot of people in this subject, because that's what they want to believe. They want to believe Armageddon, Men in Black, Alien, Terminator, and all this other stuff. They want that. They want to be scared. And that's why they mess up this field so bad.
Well, and I have never had that feeling ever. Now, another point that I wanted to bring up. Now, when you all were in Mexico, you guys were exploring what you guys knew to be a LZ, a landing zone in Mexico. And you talked about the Mexican military were aware that you were there, and they were also aware that the visitors were there, but they didn't want anything to do with it.
Well, this is what happened. George, before he passed away, he wanted to go and get some property down in the Guadalajara area, Lake Chapala, and he would lease a former consulate residence there on Lake Chapala. He liked Mexico during the 50s. It was a lot less oppressive than it was here in the United States concerning this project. Anyway, he told us the location of a extraterrestrial landing base. And in the late 60s, we went down to that area and purchased some property, a working ranch, about 80 acres, not too far from that general mountain and vicinity. In fact, you could see the mountain from our ranch right out there in the distance, probably, I'd say 15 miles away. And so when we arrived in July of 1969, within 2 weeks, the Mexican military police intelligence service showed up with 2 trucks, both loaded with soldiers and a lot of metal detection equipment, energy reading devices, electricity things, all the technology they had available at the time. So the commandant came and knocked on the door, and Dad said, "Hey, how are you doing? Come on in." My father was never antagonistic towards the officials because he knew how they operated and how he thought, and he was sympathetic in some concerns as well because they were trying to do the job the best they could based on what they were told what to do too. So in came the commandant, and he ordered all the people to go all over the ranch, and they began to do their testing. And the 2 of them are standing in this living room in front of these bay door windows. And my father says to him, he says, "You make me kind of happy because you wouldn't be here doing this if you didn't think there was something to find," which tells me something already. And so the commandant looked at the photos. We had George Adamski's photos on hanging on the wall. And he looked at them and he says, "We know they're here. We know where they come from. We know that they're good for us, but we don't want them." And so my father looked at him and said, "Well," he said, "that doesn't make a lot of sense, because if something's good for you and is good to help you and as a benefit, why wouldn't you want it?" And the commandant said, "Because it will dramatically change our political, economic, and religious foundations."
Yes.
And he said to my father, "We have received an abbreviated dossier from the Pentagon on you and your family and their activities and your experiences." And my father already knew that because Colonel Freeman told him about that when he went to show George's films in 1967 to the Pentagon and Colonel Freeman and his staff. And so we have looked over that, and he says, "You are allowed to stay, but you cannot go out amongst the people and educate them about this. If you do that, we will deport you." And so my father said to him, "Well, you don't have to worry. We don't have a spacecraft hidden here, because to tell you the truth, if I had access to one of those, I'd have left this madhouse a long time ago." and and the commandant, I think, nodded his head, probably thinking, "Yeah, me too." So so that was some of our exposure there. And yes, we did see the space visit. We were not invited to the base, and you do not go uninvited soliciting. We figured if they wanted us there, they would have come and brought us there. But we did see them. There's some of them in not far away in a local resort at that time was called Hotel San Jose Perua, which was a beautiful place built on the on the steps of a canyon, like a mini Grand Canyon. So it went through different types of environmental zones as you step down from the top all the way to the base. It was also a mineral springs and sulfur springs and baths and spas. But anyway, so we would meet them there occasionally as well. So yeah, we had for those 3 years we had extensive interaction and contact there. And then in '72, when we came back to help with Alice Wells and the continuation of the foundation, that became our emphasis then.
Well, now, once you guys started working with Alice in the foundation, did you still have visitors then too?
My father would hold meetings once a month up there in the old house of Alice and George and the foundation, and occasionally somebody would come by. You have to understand that that when they come by, they don't come by to expose themselves. They come by to either sit and be a support or to pass along arbitrarily information that they feel is necessary, either at that moment or to the people that are involved at that particular moment. I can remember that my father gave a lecture in Dusseldorf, I believe it was, and in '77, maybe it was in 81 because the book was out. And one of George's more renowned contracts sat right in the front row next to my mother and my sister.
Nice.
And it was nothing more than being present to provide support for the work that was being done then. And so they make those decisions, not us. We're not any different than anybody else, other than perhaps our dedication to this field and this program and our steadfast unwillingness to denounce it or deny it in any way, shape, or form. As I mentioned to you before, the CIA offered my father $1 million, tax-free, deposited in any bank in any country he wanted in the 1960s. That was a chunk of change.
Yeah.
That was probably equivalent to $10 or $20 million now. And if only my father would renounce George Adamski, and my father said, "Kiss my behind, I will never do that."
I would have loved to have met your dad.
Yeah, he was a most unique individual. He was one of the few people I can admiringly say that would interact with anybody and not be starstruck or position or title struck. To him, everybody was just the same as he was. There was no difference. As he used to say, everybody has to put their pants on the same way.
Exactly.
And so he talked to people from a very simplistic yet thoughtful area, and that resonates with people. And
yeah.
he would speak of his own experiences. He would not lecture or dictate to people. He wanted to discuss with people.
Yes. See, that's me. I love the conversation. Sometimes with my podcast, I get in a position of having to be the professor, and I really do not like being in that position. So through all these years and all these contacts, let's start with George. George's first contact was with one individual in the desert, right?
Well, I would say that perhaps he had some exposure before, but the first public coming out contact was on November 20th, 1952 in Desert Center. He had been taking pictures already for a number of years before that. And so he was aware of these craft. And so he said he got, there was a lot of talk at that time of crafts and landings out in the desert area. So he decided that he had gotten an impression or thought or some telepathy, whatever you want to call it, that it might be a good time to drive out into the desert and just do a kind of a road trip and have a picnic out there and see what goes on. And so they went out to Desert Center, which is the halfway point to Phoenix along Highway 10. And there's an offshoot highway there that goes to Parker, Arizona. So as you drive off the freeway and you drive north, you reach a mountain range called the Coxcomb Mountains. And they saw a cigar-shaped ship in the sky, so they pulled over on the road. and noticed the cigar-shaped craft with a lot of little crafts flying around it. And one of these bingoed off towards them and then came up over their heads and landed out in the desert, several hundred meters away from the road.
Mm-hmm.
And George walked up there, and he had a contact with the pilot, a male, about 5'7", kind of olive-colored skin, Mediterranean colored, and wearing a single-piece copperish jumpsuit, very much like a flight suit that our own pilots would wear, military pilots and what have you. And they had a discussion about where he came from. They didn't speak the same language, so George, shuffled over the sand to make it smooth at their feet because it was an old water runoff, and they would draw the solar system and point to the planets they came from and what have you. And so a number of pictures were taken, and the witnesses who watched this go by, the other 5 witnesses, and 5 or 6, and that was later reported in the Phoenix Gazette. And, I have all that archival documentation as well. If at some point you want to put something up on YouTube-wise, I'll make more than happy to make available material for you to post that. But that was one of the contacts. And George had these metal plates, these emulsion plates in his pocket because the old camera they had at that time. Most people these days cannot even remember what an old phone looks like, but an old camera with these slide-in metal plates,
Yes.
glass plates, emulsion plates. So he had blank ones in his pocket, and the space visitor pointed to his pocket, and George took one out and gave it to him. And 3 weeks later, while they were on their Mount Palomar property, this craft came flying down, and they took a picture of it, and the hatch opened on the bottom, and a package dropped out, and inside that package was the same emulsion photographic plate, except for now there were a whole series of symbols etched into it. Mm-hmm. And these symbols have to do with the propulsion system, the electrostatic propulsion system of the scout craft. And the interesting thing is that almost 10 years later, a professor, anthropology professor in the Brazilian jungle by the name of Marcel Homé, found the same type of drawings, about 80% the same, as the ones that were etched in that photographic plate. So it shows that the secrets or the information of this type of knowledge has been around for tens of thousands of years. Homé estimated those etchings to be 10 to 30,000 years old. Mm-hmm. And when you put them on, I have an image where we put them side to side, and you look at them, and it's truly amazing. And so, this kind of stuff has not happened to other contactees by any shape, way, or form. And so, like I said, George was totally unique. What amazes me is the fear and the apprehension and the aggression that the other UFO personalities project on George. When you think that these days you hear nothing but monster stories, abduction stories, all kinds of negativism, aggression, and monstrosities, this man spoke of something that was peaceful, that was educational, that had to do with human beings and the composition of life throughout the cosmos. The connectivity and standardness of that, of the origins of life from space. Not one thing that he talked about has not come through scientifically in the last 60 years. Okay. And why they are so scared of this man tells me they're scared because they don't want the truth.
Well, for me, I go back to what I said at the beginning of this. I have never had an interview, and I've done some really controversial interviews. I have never had one as suppressed as our original conversation.
Well, you said you had some comments there YouTube-wise. I remember you sent me a list of 3 or 4 of them. I lost that email somewhere in the disaster that is my desk right now, and all my papers and books all around it. But I remember one of them being, well, UFOs don't look like that, and I will say categorically that's an absolute wrong statement. Exactly. If you look historically, the bell-shaped or elliptical lenticular shape is the only ones that we have seen over time. And I will say this right now so they can all hear this and cringe. Anything that is delta-shaped, triangular, anything that is square or a block, anything that has protrusions out of the hull or the sides, anything with long extended landing gears. These are our drones, our ROVs, our own research and development craft, whether it comes from Area 51 or anywhere else that is secretly involved with the production of these type of machines. This is all us. 60 to 65% of what is seen in the skies of our world today are the development of our own military and secret agencies' craft. Another, I would say another 20% is misidentification of weather phenomena, like lenticular clouds that stack up like pancakes over a mountain because of high turbulence. And I cannot tell you how many times I've seen people say, look, there's a UFO over the mountain. No, it has to do with weather phenomena. Ball lightning that jumps horizontally from cloud to cloud. I've seen that over these big storms over the Amazon jungle. There are all kinds of weather phenomena that are mistaken because of people's misunderstanding of what is real and what is not. So that leaves about 15% of what is seen today to be actual UFO craft. In earlier times, it was a larger percentage, and I think that's because it may due to some of the distances in the orbits between the planets, and because they become bigger or smaller depending on time of year or time of century, or it may because they're busy on other planets doing other things as well. And so we're not the only to look, if you look at a Hubble telescope shot into the deepness of space, which is only, a couple of inches square by square, and you see hundreds of trillions of systems and planets, to think that we're the only intelligence in the cosmos, you have to be bat nut crazy.
Well, and extremely arrogant.
Extremely arrogant. Yeah, exactly.
I have a question for you, because I went back and looked at some of the old paintings from the 14 to the 1600s. We have three very distinct types of aircraft that are shown. One of them is one of the most famous one is the Battle in the Sky in Germany,
right?
Where they have craft that look like the jacks that you pick up off the floor. Mm-hmm. They have the long cigar shaped. They have the round ones like you and I are talking about that George took pictures of, and then they also have these giant ovals.
Well, I would say that you are seeing the craft in different manifestations. First of all, when the electrical system around the craft is tuned down, think of it like a rheostat on your light. If you turn the light down, if you twist that knob and it slowly turns the light down, you can see the light much more thoroughly, the construction of the light, how it looks. And the more you turn the power up, that power field envelops the craft like a big blanket, and you get to see that craft cover. Sometimes in the initial stages, as it looks like the craft itself, it still maintains some of the shape, but when it comes up to full power, it can look like a pearl, multicolor, pulsating pearl, whether it's round or oval or lenticular. So this has all to do with the propulsion system and in which stage it is operating at.
Mm-hmm. So that being discussed, have you noticed, I've been paying attention because I have been doing my research. Have you noticed that they are catching these craft that look like they're the size of a jet aircraft when they go by, but they are going fast, so quickly in the frame that literally 2 frames on a digital camera is all that they're being caught, and they still look like a blur.
Well, sure, because you have to understand that the optics of the camera, think of the optics of your eye. I believe your eye can only see about 4,000 frames a second. Anything that moves faster than that either becomes a blur or becomes totally invisible, because it's literally it's no strange phenomena like time shifting or dimensional stuff. That is all fantasy as well. They are simply moving at a speed that is faster than your biologics, your physical eye, can track.
Yes.
And so that speed can be increased based within the realm of their potential, and that also will reflect on the type of photographic equipment that are you using on it? And we can say, well, now that our technology is so great that we can do what, 10,000 frames a second or whatever, and we do that slow motion photography of a hummingbird, and you can see the flapping of the wings and what have you, and that's magnificent stuff. But it is still restricted by the capabilities of the equipment being used, just like we are restricted by the capability of our eyes that are just a biological parameter.
Well, and the other thing too is moving at speed would be much more practical with all the radar and all the equipment that we have on the ground now. um, but now here's another one that I just saw recently. It literally looked like something was opening up in the sky, and one of these things came out so quickly that you only caught it in 4 frames out of a whole film. I wanted to bring that up to you because would that be their technology?
Well, it could be. For instance, if they want to use the device they have, which bends light rays, that means that your eyes would not see the craft because the light rays are not reflected back to your eyes, your cornea, and your brain. It's your brain that sees anyway. It's not your eyes. But if they use the device that they have two versions of it, a small one which they wear on their persons for defense, that makes them invisible as far as the eye can see, but they are still technically present. You can see them, you can hear them, you can touch them, you can smell them. Your eyes just don't see them. If they use it for the craft, then we don't see the craft that is hanging in the sky. Now, if they want to open a hatch and drop something out, let's say like a smaller craft, that hatch area, I'm sure, has to be nullified in order for that craft to be allowed to pop out. So that may then look like something opens up in the pure clear sky and something comes out of it. That's the only other explanation that I can momentarily think of. That doesn't mean it's the only one, but it's the only practical one that I would know based on the information that I have.
Well, let's go to submarine technology. When they open up the hatch to release a diver, it becomes a signature that can be detected.
That's correct. Yes.
So it would make sense to me on that aspect of it. Now, back to the visitors. We know that he had the first visit, and it was just one individual. Um, and you talked about having conversations where they would just come and visit. And a lot of people ask me, well, what did they look like? What were they like? Were they like us? Were they quiet? What kind of information did they give?
Well, what I can tell you is that they look exactly like us, male and female.
That's what
They are varying heights, varying skin colors and eyes colors and hair colors. Not any different than when you would walk along the street in a city somewhere and you would see the multitude of other variations of peoples, the other races of people that are walking amongst us. They have different races too. They are races of human beings. They are not manifestations of different species. There are no reptilians, raelians, crayfish, sand squash people, all of this stuff. This is all imaginary. And I know that upsets people too, but that's just too bad. There are different races of people. And so they can come and they usually come and make themselves available to be seen. In other words, if in a crowded area, they will come and they will stand among the other people and they will look at you and they will send you a thought to look at them. And if you're open receptacle to receiving thoughts, then you will get the idea to suddenly look up and you see them. That's like there have been times when I've been out camping in the night sky and all of a sudden I get an impression to look up, and I could literally look up in any direction at any angle I wanted to, but I'll look up right to the spot where the craft is and it's moving through the sky because we are tying momentarily telepathically through that connection. And so it's the same thing with them. And once you recognize them, then the avenues of communication may become further. They may come and speak to you. They may come and want a chance to talk with you in private, not amongst so many other people. So they are careful, and they realize how discriminatory we are.
Mhm.
I had this question recently, how do they look? Do they look like angels? And I said to that person, I said, first of all, every single one of you have a different personification of what you think an
And then,
advanced or
yeah,
a being would look like, right? And so we have to be realistic. One space person told me, he says, you people are so discriminatory. All I have to do is put on a pair of clear glasses and walk around, and nobody would give me a second look because all of you think you're going to find perfection. And if you see somebody wear a pair of glasses on, your mind automatically says, this can't be one of them because he's wearing glasses. And in fact, we are looking discriminatorily by our senses and not allowing our feelings to, not emotions. There's a
yeah.
totally difference between feelings and emotions. We are not allowing our feelings, our intuition, our consciousness connection to help us make this very necessary revelation.
I go back to my great grandmother. My great grandmother, when I was a kid, always talked about our Sky Brothers. And this is old for people who are in Cherokee if you want to hear this, but my great grandmother always talked about our Sky Brothers, and she says, yes, they come from other places. She says, but they are brothers and sisters to us. They look just like us. They sound just like us. Um, they're just older than we are, and that was her explanation to me.
Well, because I would think that part of that is because in the Native American culture, older expresses wisdom.
Yes.
And I think that that was a way of translating uh, their wisdom of expression, and that's true. If you look at all the variants of tribes, all the way from Central American, the Mayans, even further, South Americans. If you look at all the Native American people, and especially in America as well, I don't think that there's a single tribe that does not talk about space beings coming from the sky, and then the great teacher that walked amongst them 2,000 years ago, and so on and so forth. And so um, I would say that is dying out. Many people don't realize that the symbols that the Native Americans used were from much earlier civilizations of Lemuria, and uh, and if you look at Colonel James Churchwood's book, you will see that these symbols are reminiscent of many of the Native American peoples after the Great Deluge of about 13,000 years ago.
Oh yeah. Well, and it's interesting to me that we have stories about visitors that go back as far as we have written books or written texts. Um, there's even references in Herodotus. So it makes it, and then you got all the Vimanas and all the stories that come from East Indian people too.
That's
And
right. Absolutely. And look at the Tibetan culture that states openly that the first seven kings of Tibet came from the sky and
mhm.
could go back there whenever they wanted to.
So now we have the Inky and Enlil thing coming up, and they're starting to regurgitate that again. And I'm not arguing that they might have been from somewhere else, but have you noticed that there has been a really distinct attempt to portray anybody from somewhere else as being evil and conniving and totalitarian?
Absolutely. Because, first of all, they realize that the mentality of these people on this planet, I just look from the Inquisition forward till now,
Mm,
every single horrific thing that could be done to each other, we have done.
yes.
We have nailed people to the cross, upside down and right side up. And by the way, to make it clear, most people don't realize that the Roman method of crucifixion was through the wrists, not
Yeah.
through the hands. They never nailed you through the hands because those would tear and you would fall off the cross. And
Mm,
so you were nailed through the wrists and through the crossed ankles of your feet. And
mm,
so and when you look at so many of the religious depictions, you see that it is improperly depicted too. And so But every single type of nasty, torturous thing over the period of years, whether it was Nazi Germany or Second World War Japan and China, we have done some horrific things to each other. So consequently, as a mentality, as a people, we are accustomed to these type of actions. We've heard it before and we've seen it in some cases. So consequently, we think that because we behave in this barbaric fashion, everybody else must as well. So let us be clear on the subject. To transport yourself through the reaches of space requires technology thousands of years beyond our capability now. Thousands. And you do not progress as a society, as an individual, or as a peoples by thousands of years of technology without also progressing sociologically and behaviorally as well. And so you eventually come out of this barbaric state, and as it's left so far behind in your history that you no longer relate to it. But we here on this planet relate to every type of barbarism. We have laboratories where we expect experiment on animals transferring one brain to another animal, unlike animal. We test with biologics on animals and people, as we have seen recently with COVID, and we've done this already for years. We have released biologics into this New York subway system, admittedly now that we've been caught already in the late 1960s. We put things
in San Francisco. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. And so consequently, we as a society easily relate to this barbarism because we are not but a quarter of a step away from it in our past as well and current as well. And so what we are doing is being psychologically manipulated in order to project our fears and uncertainties onto somebody else. That way, we can blame the space visitors for our good day, our bad day, our illness, our misbehavior, our emotionalism, and so on and so forth. We are working on a process of denial of responsibility for and of ourselves, because that's the only place the responsibility lies, and trying to put it on somebody else. And those who control what is going on this planet, and we've already, you and I talked about the many different layers of multi-governments and planetary organizations, right? About 36 levels of it. And and so consequently, we are being used for our own insecurities and phallicisms, because we know that if I can promote you to be afraid of your neighbor, you will not interact with them. And if I can promote them to be afraid of you, pretty soon that fear goes back and forth until we are easily manipulated by the third party, which uses us like puppets on a string. We have to break this chain.
Absolutely.
And let that go. Nobody travels millions of miles of space to take you, to take your cows and everything else. I mean, how many, think of it logically. If you look at a cow, you look at 100 cows, you look at 1,000 cows, they're all cows. You wouldn't have to grab 50,000 cows to determine, oh boy, they're all cows. These people can sit in their spacecraft in orbit, and the level of their technology is so great, they can record your conversation, they can record your mind's thoughts. They can look at you all the way down to your subatomic particles and elements in your body. They don't have to get off the comfort of their couch to come down here and do something nasty to you. Yeah, this is ridiculous. All garbage.
So let's go back to the visitors. From George himself, he said we had visitors from planets within our solar system.
Yes.
And folks, I have been doing my research. We've had visitors from within our solar system, but later on, he also talked about visitors from outside of our solar system. Can you differentiate for folks?
What's there to do? Yeah, the differential. Well, the difference is if somebody comes from San Francisco and visits you versus somebody comes from Australia and visits you,
Yeah, well,
the distance is greater, but the people aren't any different. The systems that are closest to us are Alpha Centauri, Wolf 359, and there's one more that I can't think of right now on the top of my head, but they're all within several light years away from this planet. And if you can travel at twice the speed of light, then the distances are not so great. I mean, in the olden times, we would get on a ship and sail across, for a year to go somewhere else, or get on a wagon train and travel for a year to go across the country. And for them to travel the distance of space in this method is no big deal whatsoever. But the people that come here are still people. Yeah, they vary in heights and skin colors and hair colors and eye colors and male and female, but they are not monsters. And they are not, my God, right now, what was it that I heard the other day? That we are trying to teach our children that there are 98 different sexes. And I
yeah.
I remember the old saying, if you want to know what you are, look in your underwear. It's either going to be one or the other, but it's not going to be 90. And I think to myself, how can you come up with 98 different ones?
Well,
And so,
I
and so,
laughed because I told somebody today. I told somebody today. I said, look, we know that there are three basic genders. You have male, female, and hermaphroditic, and that's it.
yeah. Yeah, that's true. That's true. There are some developments where they are neither male or female, or and those are extremely rare. But I mean, it does happen. But the idea here is that we miseducate our people, our children, our population on everything,
Exactly.
absolutely everything. And you think to yourself, my God. What is that? Why is that?
I'm flabbergasted myself. I mean, I look at the difference between, and granted, they've had advancements and they've learned different things, so I understand things do change. But then I look at what we were exposed to in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and then I look at what they're being exposed to for the last 20 years, and I'm like, what happened?
Yeah, what happened? I give you an interesting quote. This is also in chapter 10 of my new book. It's called Examining the Alien Abductions Predicament. Anyway, this was spoken by the director of the CIA in 1981, William Casey.
Yes.
We'll know our disinformation plan is complete when
Mhm.
everything the American public believes is false. His quote verbatim.
Yeah. Yeah, I know it's craziness. But now the visitors that we know that we've got intersolar and then we have extrasolar.
Yeah,
Uh, Obviously, being intersolar means that there would be more interaction. It would be easier for them to do.
sure.
Rel-
Distances are much closer.
but now that would tell you that, like you and I in last time we had this conversation, I talked about the harvesters at Saturn. You could see them on the rings. Um, and we've seen evidence that there is something built on a few of the moons. Why do you think it is so important for them to continue to cover those things up for most people?
Well, that comes to chapter 6 of my book called Why the Deception. But I'm trying to cover as many bases in the book as possible because it's a hell of a lot of work and I don't think I'll ever be writing another one. But anyway, the first of all, let's make this as simple possible.
Hmm.
It's basically a three-pronged plan. The first prong was developed in the late 40s, and this was the plan of denial. We will deny the spaceships, we will deny the recovery of the craft, we will deny the bodies of the people, we will deny them landing and interacting with us, we will deny, and hopefully everybody will just say, okay, whatever.
Yeah.
By the end of the 50s, we started the space program, Eisenhower in 58, and Kennedy, who pushed it so beautifully during his short lifespan. And that then was when we started to go into space because we needed to. We were encouraged to go into space by the space people. That is one of the reasons why they came in such numbers in the 40s and 50s, because they know we learn and replicate by example.
Mm-hmm.
Like, say, for instance, the Chinese or Japanese, they look at what we invent, they start to buy the pieces, replicate it, and all of a sudden they got it too. We saw these craft in the sky and we thought, oh, somebody else can do this, we can do it too, which is true. We're supposed to. And it was our destiny to go into space, and still is. It is probably the only thing that has kept us from mass extinction. And so now we come along to the space program, and very quickly the space program was suppressed as well. While some of the astronauts talked, some of them did not, but I would say probably a good 50% of them did talk, and 100% of them were exposed as having UFO visits, photographs, or sightings during the space program already from Mercury on, through the entire space program. And in fact, Armstrong talked about a UFO hanging right over his head on the Apollo 11 landing, and we have that picture. We uncovered that in the late 70s, and we put it on the back cover of our book. We discovered alien bases on the moon, and you can't deny it. And so what happened is that as we started to go into space, we started to have exposure to what is going on out there. It starts to fill in the gap by saying, well, if we don't believe the program of denial, then we have seen that by going into space, we have fortified the fact that there is life and intelligence out there, and that will erase the lie that was created before. And there's one thing about a lie, and most people know this, is if you tell one, you're going to tell more, because you have to support the first lie with a second one, third one, and so on and so forth. Otherwise, your house of cards comes falling apart. So then we started to deny the information that we found in space, but it has not been successful. Because if we look at just from what we have discovered on the moon, spraying water geysers, Goldilocks zones that are constantly 63 degrees Fahrenheit, atmosphere, higher gravity, solar winds, and atmospheric pressure gradients, which are winds across the moon as well, which cause the flapping of the flag, and many other things. Causing the drifting of the debris behind the lunar rover to the ground. If you did not have greater gravity and atmosphere, those particles would continue to drift offwards into space. They wouldn't come down to the ground in a nice rooster tail plume like you see behind a speedboat on the lake. And so we started to see that there is a commonality in creation just replicated on our moon. And that's what George Adamski reported in 1955 when he went aboard the spaceships and was flown around the moon. He reported the exact same things already years before our own space program. Now we go to the other planets and we think, well, if we expose life on those planets, then people are going to say, well, heck, that life's on those planets. Those planets are close to here. That's the intelligence that's coming here. That's negating the denial that we started already in the beginning. So we have to continue the lie even further by telling you that Venus is 800 degrees, the atmosphere is 6 times thicker than boiling oil, that the winds are 400 miles an hour, but yet we managed to land multiple probes with a parachute. How in the world is that physically possible?
Well, what do you think about our interference on these other planets as far as like sending probes and things like that?
I don't think that that's a problem whatsoever, because they know that the more we explore, the greater the likelihood, the greater the probability that more information of higher resonance and quality will be exposed. I give you an example. I have found one picture in my research, one picture of Venus taken by Mariner 10 in 1970. And when you look at that picture, you can see bands of clouds, below it, beautiful blue background, like it looks like Earth from space with the oceans below it, and you can see 2 polar ice caps. Now, how can polar ice caps exist at 800 degrees Fahrenheit?
Exactly.
It's not possible.
I posted those two pictures when I put that up on Twitter,
Oh, good.
and I said courtesy of you and the foundation. Um, Folks just don't, we have an advantage of coming out of the 70s and 80s where a lot of this stuff we could get our hands on. By the late 80s, they were burying this stuff so quickly. And they started that disinformation campaign, just blasting people with the distances and the temperatures and how impossible all this stuff was. Whereas when we came up, we had people in the 70s and even into the 80s that were saying, "Hey, it's very, very possible." So,
Absolutely. Yeah.
do you think that we actually have bases on Mars yet, or are we just on the moon?
Well, I can only say this: the information that I read in the book Alternative 3, and it was a documentary that was released in the United Kingdom and caused such an overnight panic, equivalent to Orson Welles' War of the Worlds, that they immediately pulled it from the airwaves. They said and released a statement that has now been classified as fiction and has never come to surface again. But that book discussed not only the brain drain of scientific personnel and their families disappearing, but also arbitrary laborers being, for lack of a better word, and I hate using this word, abducted to provide the scientific acumen and raw labor needed to construct our military lunar bases. And that's a one-way ticket. Nobody comes back, period. And they also discussed that we have used our experimental electrostatic magnetic craft that we developed after the accumulation of not only Cape Girardeau, but Roswell and numerous other acquisitions that happened, because those weren't the only two crash landings on the whole planet by any stretch of the imagination. And we used that technology to go to Mars in '65. I can't personally verify that, but let me say this, it wouldn't surprise me.
No, Steve, that's me. I had originally, when I came across it, thought that between 65 and 68 is when they had suggested that we had gone to Mars already. Um, do you find it interesting that even to this day, we have the best of the brains. We have physicists, we have uh, engineers, we have some of the preeminent medical people, some of the most developed builders that have a little bit different twist on the way to build things. We still have these people disappearing on a regular basis for the last 30 years.
Yeah, that's true. And there's been, like I said, there has been some talk about the so-called brain drain, where
Hmm.
they have taken on a one-way ticket somewhere else in order to develop our secret facilities that we don't want anybody to know about. The rumor, and I've heard this one too from UFO personalities, and sometimes I have to take blood pressure medication because it gets me up so much. But they have said that the astronauts of our space program have been told and warned off the moon. This has nothing to do with extraterrestrials. This is our own warning. We have warned our own people off the moon because we have a two-tiered system. One where, with like Project Horizon, we've already been on the moon for a number of years before the Apollo landings. And then the Apollo astronauts that go there that had no clue that there was already a pre-military program and installation to begin with. And those were the ones that warned our astronauts off so that they would not become more exposed. And so that's why we watch very diligently when you have Clementine, the probe that goes military secret probe to take high resolution photographs and HD radar images and LiDAR images of the entire moon. You're not thinking they're doing this because they got nothing else to do for lunch. They're doing it for a very specific reason. They want to know who's there, where they are, and what's going on. And now that we have other multiple countries, well, we just had India just put their probe successfully on the lunar surface this week, and the Russians did not. And I think that's because of some miscalculations. But let me be also clear as well. Let us not disparagingly accuse everybody that's involved in the space program or its consortium of complicity in this vast cover-up. It's not that complex. Think about this. If you change the calibration of the instruments on the probe before you send it. So let's make this simple for people to understand. Let's say you have a temperature gauge, and before you send it, you recalibrate the gauge so it reads 300% more than what it actually is. Right? So there's a very small inner cadre of people who know what this recalibration factor is. When the data is sent back from our space vehicles through mission control, through Caltech, JPL, and these other places, these engineers are sitting at the computer seeing the data as it's being projected, and they accept it as face value because they would know no different.
Exactly.
But if I wanted to keep it secret, all I needed to do was initiate a calibration error before I sent the instrumentation, and then I alone know how to read the instruments for what they really say by reducing that error. It's just like on my airplane. If I do not set the altimeter correctly and the barometric pressure and all of this, my instruments will read falsely of what is actually going on. It would say 33,000 feet, but in actuality, I may be lower than that, like 32,800 feet or 32,200 feet. And so without the proper calibration, you cannot get a proper, accurate reading. And that's how easy it is to compromise the data. And you don't have to involve all these other people.
Nope, just one person.
One or two people. That's it.
Well, you know, for me, it's really interesting because all these reports, especially from the 50s and 60s, of visitors from Venus, from Mars, Saturn, Jupiter. Somebody, I remember one that said that they had been visited from Neptune.
Yeah, I would say that's a true statement.
So with them coming and going, it seems to me like you'd think you'd think after almost 70 years that they would be making some kind of a headway.
Well, first of all, you have to look behind the reasons. Some of the people who come here may just be coming as visitors, like you would go on vacation somewhere. They come someplace to see what it's like, what the people are like, what their mentality is, what they think. For them, it's like traveling in time. Even though time travel does not exist, you can go to a place where the behaviorisms are from an earlier time, like any difference in you flying an airplane to Manaus in Brazilian jungle and then go walk around the native people there. You see how people have lived thousands of years ago. You didn't step into some stupid time portal and machine. You went somewhere where the representation of how things were lived is from that particular era. And that's the same thing they do here. They come and visit, and some may come just to visit, some may come just to explore, some may come to and interact with us to help us out. It's not that every space person is coming here for the same reason.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because there's an old reference, and I'm trying to remember who it was. I want to say it was Arthur C. Clarke. But there's an old reference from one of the old science writers that said, if there are people visiting this planet from other planets and other solar systems, this would be a school that would teach them what not to do.
That's exactly a true statement, because we have against natural progression and natural law, we have developed nuclear weapons capable of destroying ourselves rather than being used for the good of our populations. The first thing we do is whenever we get a new invention, it's not for you and my benefit. It's not for the benefit of people. It's right away determined how it can be weaponized. And that's why the space people are so damn careful about what they show and give us, because we quickly develop weapons that we cannot control that can either destroy ourselves or harm them. I mean, that's that's the reality of it.
There was a gentleman, and I want to say it was in the 1970s, because I cannot for the life of me remember the book, But in the 1970s, there was a book written about nanotechnology and how it could heal, how it could be one of the most beneficial technologies to humanity, because if they could figure out a way to create nanoparticles that could work within your system, it could not only heal you, but could give you abilities like space travel with much less repercussions, because we didn't have the technology to shield us and this and that and the other. But the nanotechnology could heal us as we went. And what's the first thing they do with nanotechnology once they figure out how to make it? Instead of doing what the science fiction writers of the time said, turning it into a positive, healing, beneficial thing, they figured out how to weaponize it.
Well, that's it, and that's our mentality, and so people do come to observe us for our mentality, because we have twice knocked on the door of nuclear obliteration, and the space people have walked us and talked us back from it. But there's a certain point in time where there's only so much they can do, and if we become too impetuous and too reactionary, we can do it to ourselves,
Yeah,
and that will be the end of the story.
I know. I know. Now, somebody sent me an email and they said, the one question you didn't ask is the one question that most people would ask. And I don't think the way that most people do. I just don't. My experience in my life, I don't think the way. This is the question that I wanted to end this one on, Glenn. I got an email and they said, what did the visitors, if Glenn could pick one thing that the visitors have relayed over 70 years at this point, what would be the one thing that you would say that people needed to hear the most, that either you or your father or George had heard from our visitors?
I would say that probably the most important, and definitely the first domino on the chain of recognition and change is to recognize that we are not alone. We
Mhm.
are totally saturated around us with intelligence, with expression, with progression, that is all part of our own heritage.
Mhm.
We belong in this neighborhood and with these neighbors. And if we finally recognize this, the step of that recognition will move forward to join them. And by stepping forward to join them, the rest of all the doors will open. Because when you join them, you cannot hide what happens on the moon. You cannot hide what happens on the other planets, because you yourself, as population, as people, are traveling to these areas to see it for yourself. And no threat, no piece of secrecy paper, and no amount of intimidation can keep you from recognizing that. So once we accept that, the rest of the doors open to us, and all the other avenues of the things that we are looking for will become known to us. Know the truth and know yourself, and you shall know all things.
Yeah, for me, I always think. Do you remember the Star Trek movie where they helped the guy get his ship up into space, and all of a sudden the Klingons noticed him and came down and visited? Do you remember that movie?
Yeah, that was I think Contact, and one of the New Generation movies.
Yeah.
Yeah, the developer of the warp drive.
Yeah, and I got thinking after your and my last conversation, I got thinking, we've already been up there, and they still haven't learned anything. They're still trying to behave like they did, 100 years ago. They still think they're barbarians for some reason. Um,
Well, remember that space travel changes us. I remember years ago, a very large, nice coffee table book was put out. I think it was either titled or had to do with the perceptions of the astronauts, whether it was in Muir or the Skylab or whatever, the space station. And all of them, regardless of what country they came from, said that once you got into space and looked down on the planet, you notice that there are no geographical lines, there are no countries, we are covered by a thin atmosphere, we are a very fragile existence, and that if we do not take care of it, This is the only place at the moment where we have to go. And and when you hear things like I believe it was Musk who said that wants to, go to Mars and set up extensions of our civilization and so on and so forth. My question is, why would you develop Mars when you come from a planet that is a garden paradise in comparison to Mars? Why wouldn't you spend those resources to take care of your planet and still go to Mars as exploration, but not this fanciful notion that you will have to develop it as an escape valve for whoever the chosen are to go to Mars when we destroy Earth? Oh, hell no.
Why not fix the planet? I know the logic and the rationale that they have makes no sense to me. We're going to continue to destroy everything here and invest our money on trying to go and destroy something else.
That's exactly it.
Repair what we have here. And it is still repairable, even though they've done the damage with GMOs and hybridization and all the other. They could still clean it up if they wanted to. They have resources.
One of the most interesting programs I've ever seen is the one that's on the television. I can't remember whether it's History or Geographic or whatever. And it's basically a timeline of how things would look if people were not here anymore. And they show the city, how nature is growing in after 100 years. And after 500 years, you don't even see it anymore. How quickly it would be in geological terms, 1,000 years or a couple, to completely revamp the entire world if we were not here to negatively impact it. So the question is that obviously extinction isn't a viable alternative, not at least an intelligent one. So why in the world would you go to extinction when all you have to do is turn your energies around and to prosper and cooperate with nature? This is what the space people have learned a long time ago. They do not fight against nature. They don't have anti-gravity. They have pro-gravity. There is not such thing as antimatter. There is pro-matter. There are all things that which nature produces in abundance, energy sources, recognition and education and value, all things available to us. All we have to do is recognize it. As I mentioned to you once before, the guy who developed the most efficient water pump, when they asked him where he got the idea from, he said he looked at a cutaway of a Nautilus and looked at all the different changers and the curvature, and he replicated that, and nature provided the answer in order to increase one's technology. They used nature to advance. We destroy nature during our advance. If we do not change course pretty soon, we will suffer some very dire consequences, and I think we already are.
We already are, but I mean, if they don't reverse, if they don't reverse the course they're on right now, I could really easily see human extinction not very far down the road.
I think we will come to geophysical change before that. Right now, the planet is under its 26,000 year cycle in which geophysical change is coming. The solar system, the sun, is under its 1,000 year cycle. When the two of them can converse at the same time, then you have an accelerated repercussion traveling through the solar system. Our solar system is in the downward cycle, in the degradation stage, and we do not need any extra emphasis or encouragement to accelerate that stage beyond its natural timeline. Then we will cause the destruction of our own solar system, and there will be planetary changes, just like there was 12,000 years ago, in which the majority of the population perished, and you just had outlying colonies of people that started all over again, that went from a high technological state into a state of disparity where they had to live in caves and had to basically start this process all over again in some areas of the world. And so while we only recognize what we call prehistory or pre certain species historical states, we had vast technologies before that. But geophysical changes are natural, and we have volcanoes and earthquakes that are increasing. And if we do not pay attention to this, This will not, this will cause great harm to most of the people because they live on geophysical faults like Los Angeles and San Francisco. They live on the coastal areas that have large tidal or tsunami waves come, will wipe out a large number of our cities on the coastal regions. We can suffer some very dire circumstances.
For me, it's like I did a podcast a while back, and I talked about we had advanced cultures that used Earth-centric technology. The pyramids. We had cities that were built like collectors for computers. You can even see the design. They look like a motherboard. They were using Earth-centric technology to do what they did, and they didn't survive the geological changes. So now we're anti-Earth centric with most of the technology that's around us. What makes people think that as anti-Earth as most of the things that we use, that we're going to survive the next one?
Well, nobody wants to think about anything. I mean, think of this very simple concept. If you pump millions of barrels of oil out from underneath the planet's crust, what do you expect to happen? One, you create huge caverns between the layers of the plates and the Earth's crust, which can only resettle and cause great seismic change in activity, sinkholes, all kinds of things. Plus, this material doesn't come from dinosaurs. This concept that dinosaurs stopped living, how many billions of dinosaurs would there be to just supply the barrels of oil that are 20 million that were consumed every day? And so what happens is this material is necessary to the geophysical structure and well-being of the planet, most likely to lubricate as well between the plates and the fault zones. So the more we keep pulling stuff out, the more it's like we're sitting in a lifeboat. And while we're sitting in the lifeboat and the sharks are circling, somebody's got a pocket knife and keeps punching holes in the side of the boat and each one of the bladders to see how soon it will be before we sink.
I know. Isn't it terrible? Glenn, I want to thank you for spending more time with me, and hopefully we get to do this again. Folks, his book, we hope, will be out in October, and I guarantee you I'll get him back on so we can promote his book. Glenn, let them know about the foundation and how they can get a hold of you.
Right. You can find me on the internet at Adamski, ADAMSKI Foundation, all one word, .com. You will find our website in there. Our website is informational. It is not one of these, video game kind of places to entertain. We want to provide information for people to learn and not to entertain. So you will see that there. There's a lot of information on it.
Mm-hmm.
And as Raven mentioned, you can also see on the YouTube links a lot of the communications and interviews and films and things like that as well. So you can get a view of that. You'll find my email on the internet site as well. Be advised that I answer emails sporadically. I will eventually get to it, but I am at my age not a techno junkie. I use the computer and the phone to provide a service, and I don't wake up, turn it on, and sleep with it and all that other stuff. So I'll get to it eventually. It's just that I don't do it every day because my mind needs a break sometimes too.
Well, now you said that you had a couple of interviews that were on television. Now I want to highlight that for people so they can find you. You said Gaia?
Yeah, Gaia is a what's the word for it? Hell, a program that is out of Boulder, Colorado, and they do a lot of interviews of people that are related to this subject. And one of the interviewers is Regina Meredith, and I did several interviews with her, one on George Adamski, one on something else, in the last 10 years. And I also did one at the same facility for George Norrie for his program Beyond Belief. And I was on the air with him a couple of times, a long time ago. And hopefully when the new book comes out, I'll send him a copy and we'll talk once again. So you will find those programs. I think were rather well done. There's a program that just came out by Eli Watson, a young man that doesn't live too far away from me. We did two 2-hour interviews about George Adamski, and I must say that I was so well impressed with the outcome. I think they're on YouTube as well. And so, and then if you look at YouTube under my name, you'll find a number. You can either find them under Glenn Steckling, or I have found that some of them were classified under Glenn Steckling Adamski. Maybe that means the tandem thing. But if you look under those two searches, you will find quite a bit of information.
Nice, nice. And folks, don't forget, you also at the website, the foundation website, you can also get these books. And if you happen to be overseas, use Abe or Amazon or whatever you need to in order to get access to them. But I highly recommend them because you're not going to find anything similar in the environment of the UAP today.
Yeah.
And thank you very much for coming back on with me. I will get this thing put up as quick as I can, folks. I am going to put these up in tandem, so you'll be able to find both of the interviews on YouTube shortly too, not just on my Spreaker or the other podcast repeater sites. That being said, Glenn, thank you for the time, and I definitely look forward to the next time we get to do this.
Well, Raven, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a very great privilege to interact with you. It's nice to have a continuity of thought and ability to bounce back and forth. You might want to tell your listeners that the first interview, we had some audio problems at the end that cut in and out for whatever reason that was. But so far, this one I've seen, we've had clear audio the entire program.
Well, folks, every once in a while it does happen because, like, I'm on the East Coast, he's on the West Coast. But that first interview, yeah, there's a little bit of an issue with the audio, but folks, you'll definitely enjoy that, and I recommend it. If you're just now catching us on this one, you might want to listen to the first one before you go through this one. But now we're at the end of it, so you already are behind, right?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, all I can tell you as a closing thought is to question everything.
Absolutely, absolutely. Glenn, thank you very much, folks. I'm going to hit the stop button now. Thank you for your time, because we wouldn't do these podcasts and conversations if you weren't listening to us.